The coronavirus rescue bill that just passed the Senate, expected to pass the House tomorrow, has $400 million to help states implement systems like absentee voting and voting by mail in the eventuality that what we're going through right now with physical distancing and lockdowns will continue for a while, possibly even in some form until the general election in November. Now, that $400 million support the states to implement that. That number is far below what advocates wanted. They had asked for $2 billion, but it's more than the paltry $140 million figure originally offered up by Senate Republicans. Now, there's still a ton of open questions about what all this means for conducting democracy during a pandemic. Joining me now, someone who thinks about this just about every second of every day, Stacey Abrams, who's been fighting for free and fair elections as the founder of Fair Fight Action, also a former candidate for governor of Georgia. Let's start, Stacey, with where you are. You're in Georgia, and before we get to the bill and the elections, things there look pretty intense, particularly in Atlanta. What is your assessment of where things are right now in your home state, and how the response has been at the state level?
Today, the governor of Georgia and the mayor of Atlanta had a town hall, and they provided additional information. But there continues to be concern about the diversity of responses depending on which county you're in, which city you're in. And so I think one of the challenges is making sure there is a unified response. And so we're waiting to see the next steps that the governor takes. But I will tell you that one of the organizations I started in the wake of the 2018 election was called SEAT, the Southern Economic Advancement Project, because we know across the South, the 12-state region, that this is a region that has the most vulnerable populations. We have higher levels of poverty. We have lower levels of access to public benefits, and those public benefits tend to pay less. We have less paid leave. And so almost every one of the issues that we're facing in the wake of COVID-19 are hitting the South harder. And so at SEAP, we are working to connect people with resources. So we have a map where we've connected with all of our community networks, where we're listing the organizations that are offering support from community to community. But I raise that because as much as we need the federal government to take action, we cannot forget the responsibility that states have. States like Kentucky and Louisiana and North Carolina, the governors have taken executive action to expand coverage of Medicaid, to expand access to unemployment benefits, to ensure that people actually receive the support they deserve and that the public benefits meet the need of the moment. And so I think it's critical that in Georgia and across the South, we ask governors to go beyond the minimum and do what we need to ensure that every person is protected in this crisis.
In terms of elections, there was a big battle, even a showdown over the funding in this bill. The idea behind the $2 billion figure from advocates was they priced out that's what it would cost to implement some form of no excuse absentee voting, vote by mail in every state, should it come to that in November. What's your assessment of where the legislation ended up?
Of course, we're disappointed that the full $2 billion wasn't allocated, but I'm pleased that we have $400 million. That's much more than the Republicans initially offered. And what we know is that this has to be a down payment in our democracy. There is no do-over for the November elections. The Constitution does not permit a delay of that election, which means we have to be prepared for there not to be a miracle in May that changes the world. We need to be prepared for a pandemic that disrupts our elections, and we need to anticipate what the solution looks like. That means online voter registration, same-day registration, and the resources necessary for paid postage, because it's not enough to say you can mail in your ballots if the post office is closed or if you can't get there. And so we have to assume that we need multiple solutions. That's mail-in ballots. That's also making sure that we can have some locations for people to vote. There may be communities that have to go in to vote. We know that there are a number of Native American communities that have very irregular post office access, and that could be almost negligible by this time. And so we have to anticipate now for November. And the reality is, as a nation, we should be good at this by now. And my assumption is that the bill is a down payment and it's a starting conversation, but more will be done.
You know, one of the awful realities of American politics is a sort of partisan divide over voting access. Generally, Democrats have sought to enlarge it, to increase access, and Republicans have sought to constrict it where possible. Sometimes they're just very flat out admit that. They say that's their goal. I do wonder in an environment in which people find their lives disrupted, if the possibility of Republicans maybe getting religion on this or understanding the need to allow people to vote, particularly if it's their own constituencies who may have a hard time doing that, if it might change that kind of partisan valence?
I think it could. I mean, we've seen Governor Mike DeWine, someone with whom I do not normally agree, take affirmative action to ensure that mail-in ballots are going to be available in their postponed election. In the state of Georgia, the Secretary of State agreed with the Democratic Party that we need to mail ballots to every voter. Now, we're still in disagreement about the fact that these won't be postage paid, because in Georgia, a volunteer can't offer to pay for a stamp. That's actually a violation of state law. And so the state has to agree to pay for it. And we need to make sure that in every single state that we make access available. And we are hearing Republicans and Democrats say this is necessary, because democracy isn't partisan. We are partisan. We pick the sides. But democracy itself is about the conversation. And we have to remember that whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent, you have a right to pick your leaders. And that happens in November. And every person who wants to participate, who is eligible, should be allowed to do so.
Stacey Abrams, in these bizarre, surreal times, it's wonderful to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us.